indeed. Mr. Adegboruwa joins us on the program this morning, a senior advocate and human rights activist, is right here with us in our Lagos studio. Good morning, and thank you for joining us on Sunrise Daily.
Thank you very much for having me.
What a day it was yesterday. I mean, we saw organized labor protesting on the streets of not just the nation's capital, but across states of the Federation. And essentially, they were protesting against what they described as the anti-people policy of the Tinubu government. We understand that central to that, of course, is the recent hike in the price of petrol, the cost of living, and all of that. I mean, you're an activist as well. We saw senior lawyers joining Labour, and I realized I didn't see you joining them. Was that intentional? Is your protest away from the streets and more in the courts, just on the side, that is?
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here. I think that we, the people of Nigeria, with Labour, in spirit and in action, and we commend the Nigeria Labour Congress led by Comrade Joe Ajaro and the TUC, and indeed all Labour and civil society coalition. We have various areas of collaboration with Labour, both on the street, in the court system, and in various other platforms. So at times it may be necessary for us to do background work for Labour to ensure that the process is successful. But beyond that is to also say that, you know, we're coming to a stage in Nigeria where the masses must be allowed to breathe, if I can use that word. And I commend the government on the one part that throughout Nigeria, in Lagos, in Abuja, Port Harcourt, Kaduna, the protests were peaceful, and then there was no incident recorded at all. So that shows you clearly that in the past, when these protests or strikes or demonstrations have taken place and you have incidents, it's always provoked by government agencies and fit columnists. If the police would do its duty of providing protection for peaceful protesters, you will keep seeing things like this going on in this country without any incident. So it's commendable on the part of government, or also the law enforcement agencies, and also commendable on the part of Labour. And we should see more of this, not just Labour, but indeed the opposition political parties. I'm talking about People's Democratic Party, Labour Party. You know, you do not take politics as just taking crumbs from the table. The opposition is supposed to keep government on its toes. It's not a place to share ministerial lists or offices or crumbs in the National Assembly or in government quarters. An opposition party is supposed to be the voice of the people, to keep x-raying the policies of government and then giving objective alternatives every now and then. But we're not seeing that in PDP and even in Labour Party.
And I see that you wrote a piece, I think it was about a month ago, Tinubu on familiar turf, if I'm correct. And then part of what you said was that the euphoria of fuel subsidy removal by President Tinubu, the commendations from foreign nations about the exchange rate unification, the devaluation of Naira would seem to have driven the president into some kind of inaction, whereby 1 month after his inauguration, there's no cabinet in place, and then you talked about quite a number of things. And do you agree that indeed these policies, or at least the removal of fuel subsidy and the hike in petrol, are anti-people? Because what we saw when the president removed subsidy was some sort of jubilation from people saying, oh, long-term coming. But before we get into what's playing out in the courts, particularly for this, do you also see it as anti-people, as Labour has described it?
Well, maybe we should give some background to this. In 2012, the federal government explained to the people of Nigeria that subsidy needed to go. We were told by the opposition political parties, then led by the current president, that it was necessary to subsidize fuel and other parts of the people of Nigeria in terms of our economic survival. And we believed them at the time. For me, personally, I believe that subsidy should go, but it should go along with other arrangements that must have been put in place by the government. First is that you need to at least show some kind of empathy with the people of Nigeria in terms of the luxuries of governance, the convoys, the offices. You see now that instead of cutting the ministerial portfolio, the president has added to it. We now have 42, which shows that there is no economic problem or hardship on the part of the executive. So if you want the people to agree with your own policy, you then must lead by example in terms of the leadership giving sacrifices that people can verify. For instance, in terms of salaries, in terms of allowances, whether in the Senate or in the executive. So I believe that subsidy should go, in fairness, because we have been told, and I believe that it was just a corrupt system that, is benefiting some few people. But for that to go, the refineries must work, because we can't keep importing fuel. And then also you unbundle the NNPC, because if you say there is no subsidy, why is NNPC fixing prices? It's always the NNPC stations that determine what other marketers will charge. That means that there's no deregulation as it's affecting kerosene, diesel. You can go to any filling station today and buy diesel at a particular price. You go to another filling station, it may be lesser. So that's deregulation. And then also the government says that he has invested in the Dangote Refinery and that he was going to work in July. And now we are in August and it's not working. So you need to get people to agree or understand your policies, before you announce the subsidy removal. And I think that's the challenge that we have about subsidy removal. We have no doubt that it should go, but that the appropriate conditions for implementing that policy were not in place as at the time the president made that announcement.
Mr. Adegboruwa, so many questions to ask around the refinery and government state, but let's quickly look at what played out yesterday. On the one hand, it was reassuring to see that the president in fact met with the leadership of the TUC and the NLC, and a team from the National Assembly also met with them. But then again, we now heard that the federal government had filed a contempt suit against the leadership of the TUC and the NLC for the mass protests nationwide. What do you think is playing out there?
I think we should just explain, as a lawyer, for there to be law and order in society, everybody must obey the order of a court. Once an order is given, you have to obey it. If you are not satisfied with the order, you either appeal against it or you challenge it to have it set aside. But the order that was granted by the National Industrial Court on the 5th of June was in respect of a strike action. The NSC gave notice when fuel subsidy was removed and price went to 518 or 68 naira. So it gave a notice to engage government, if certain conditions were not met. And the federal government went to court and secured an ex parte order. So any case filed is limited to the facts of the case. So I believe that the case that was filed by the federal government was against labor, and in respect of that strike notice that was given in respect of the initial increase in fuel prices. But while the case was pending, the federal government itself did not abide by the contents of the case. The fuel subsidy, fuel price also went up again to 600 and something. So the facts changed. And that means that the order that was granted probably did not cover the recent event, unless there's been an amendment, and that amendment has not taken place. So I believe that the order was limited to the first strike notice that was given. That's one. Number two, I think from the explanations given by labor, it was not a strike. They went on a protest in exercise of their fundamental right under Section 39, because our constitution gives the right to every citizen to freely associate together, and also for freedom of expression. And then secondly is also that those of us in labor, in civil society organizations, we were not part of the case. The federal government did not sue the civil society organizations, Committee for Defense of Human Rights, or the organizations that we represent. So we were not part of the suit. And you see that we were part of the protest yesterday. So I don't think that there is any contempt, in fairness, from my understanding of this case.
That labor has run foul.
I do not think so. But I do not support that any party should violate the order of a court. But in this particular case, there is a distinction, in the sense that the strike is not what has been declared. And also a major component of the protest is civil society, and we're not part of the case between federal government and labor. And I must say one thing, because, and in fairness to the federal government, you cannot go to court on a matter like this if we were to advise the federal government as lawyers, because you cannot get a court order to restrain hunger. You cannot get a court order to restrain suffering, because everything we're doing in this country is based on what all of us are experiencing. I buy fuel, I run generator. So there's no way you can pretend that these things are not real. So the option is to address them, because court is a technical place where you just make judgments, you give judgments, you make orders. It will not address my stomach. It will not address the salary of workers. It will not address the suffering of the masses of our people. It will not address the Greek collapses and darkness that the government has imposed on us. So I think the reality is for the government to engage them. And I commend the president that, and maybe for the first time, we have a president sitting down with labor to engage and discuss, and you saw that indeed helped to douse the tension when there is personal engagement. But it should go beyond engagement and rhetorics. If you say the refinery is going to work in December, that's Port Harcourt Refinery, at what capacity?
And very quickly, before you go off on that trajectory, relatedly, there's no Minister of Justice or Attorney General of the Federation, yet the federal government is able to quickly initiate this suit. But on the other hand, the National Association of Resident Doctors were to embark on strike, but government appealed to them saying that there is no cabinet yet, and there's no minister. Should we hold government accountable in that regard? Is government justified to say that the president does not have the details, the facts of the matter, and as such, the doctors should be patient?
I think I take it from what Comrade Joe Ajero said at the end of his meeting with the president. When journalists were asking whether the NLC and TUC will call off the strike, he said, we have met a president who understands our language, who also is part of us in terms of having experience in organized protest and strike. The president got to power through opposition, through protests, through strikes. I mean, even while a president was in place, as a presidential aspirant, he went to Abeokuta to challenge a sitting president with that Abeokuta declaration. So he's somebody who's used to opposition. So I believe that one of the things we should see as a change in the current government is that you don't wait until unions embark on strike or give notices to address their issues. Because before you got to a stage when doctors declared a notice to go on strike, they've been writing letters, they've been making announcements, they've been holding press conferences. So I think one of the few things we want to see in this particular regime is that the engagement of labor unions, of civil society organizations should not come only when strikes have been declared. And it's important to have that transparency on the part of government, because you can't say you don't have a cabinet to address a labor challenge on the one hand for doctors, and then suddenly you also then have a cabinet that is able to engage labor and civil society to go and commence contempt proceedings. So the government has to come out clean and be transparent.
Let's take a deeper look at this contempt proceedings matter, because it's important to really understand what's playing out. So yes, on the 5th of June, the case before Justice Anoue, that order was given, and essentially this is the order that was given by Justice Anoue, says that the defendants or respondents are hereby restrained from embarking on the planned industrial action or strike of any nature pending the hearing and determination of a motion or notice dated dates June the 5th. And I know there's been this back and forth. Mr. Falano, the Ministry of Justice, in fact, the Solicitor General, Mrs. Jedi Agba, had come out to say that, well, the government is not saying labor should not protest, or anyone at that should not protest. But she said that essentially what her statement had said was, if labor is going to be protesting against subsidy removal, which is the issue in court already, that might constitute contempt of court, because essentially courts say you should maintain status quo once a case is before the court. So I'm just trying to give a background as to the back and forth that has been playing out. So if labor is saying, well, this is not a strike action, and the Ministry of Justice, the Solicitor General, is saying, well, but you're protesting on an issue which is before the court, what would be your own view then, seeing all this build up to this point?
Like I said earlier, I do not support any violation by any means of a subsisting order of court. But I think that there is a need for clarification. Yesterday's protest, and not a strike, was not against subsidy removal per se. The points being raised by labor and civil society, we talked about anti-people policies, increment in school fees. We talked about electricity generation.
And the reversal in the recent hike in the price of petrol.
Which is about 610, not the initial one.
In fact, 637.
Yes.
But isn't that tied to subsidy removal?
Well, for me, if subsidy removal is what federal government took to court, then the matter is limited to that. Once the issues involved is, number one, not a strike, because indeed you will recall that offices opened yesterday. From the report of your correspondent who covered the event, it shows that Labour, first of all, went to the Ministry of Justice, and the place was open, which means workers reported for work.
So a protest is not an industrial act?
No, it's not. And I must make that difference. So it's possible, for instance, you as Coyote, maybe your union has declared a protest to go to Alausa or to move on the street. You take an excuse from your boss to participate in that protest, to exercise your fundamental and constitutional right.
And the boss in this case is the federal government, and I imagine the federal government did not give them the excuse, or at least did not allow them to go on that protest.
Well, the federal government didn't say that they didn't grant workers the right to protest.
That's an interesting angle.
It is a strike that government is complaining about, and strike is that you cease from reporting for work. You have taken a decision not to participate, not to engage in any official work at all, and for a particular period of time. And by this morning, I don't think there's any protest going on again. So it was important to make that distinction that what the court sought to restrain, Labour has not violated that from their own presentation. No strike has been declared at all.
Now, back to this subject of refineries, although the federal government didn't directly address the nation or Labour on that, but the feedback we got from the president of the TUC, who spoke on our sister program yesterday, was that the president gave an assurance that by the end of the year, the Port Harcourt refinery would, be back on stream. But then again, we had officials of the last administration report that it would have been working by December last year, and then the NMDPRA also said it would be working by January this year, but now we're in August. Should we accept wholesale this time around this new target date for the delivery of the Port Harcourt refinery?
I think the first thing is to urge the president to make a holistic declaration, because we're talking about the investment of the money of the people of Nigeria. What is the status of Kaduna Refinery, of Warri Refinery, and then of Port Harcourt? Because he's only just mentioned Port Harcourt. And money was invested in turnaround maintenance and resuscitation of all the refineries. That's one. The second angle is for me to appeal to Labour, and I think it's important. If there is turnaround maintenance going on in any of the refineries, Labour should be the first person to know, because they are the ones working there. So they also owe the people of Nigeria, and as we have told them, to go around and do their own auditing of those refineries, so that it doesn't stop at presidential declarations. If indeed there's any turnaround maintenance going on, if Warri Refinery or Port Harcourt will work in December, Labour and TUC should be in a position to tell Nigerians. So after the presidential declaration, Labour should do its own auditing. But beyond that itself, the government should be giving monthly briefing. Because if something is to work in December, by August we will be able to know. By September, give us a breakdown of what work has gone. By October, November, and then at what capacity? Because I mean, it's not just to say it will be pumping, and it's only pumping maybe at 10% capacity, which should see through us into where we are now. So it should involve a declaration of the quantum of production that will be involved in those refineries, so that we can know whether it will meet the demands of consumption of Nigerians.
Yeah, but a quick one here. Should we be asking more questions relating to accountability? If the Dangote refinery could have been built in 4 years, but the Buhari administration reportedly spent 11 trillion naira on fixing of refineries, and yet they're not working over a period of, if you also calculate a period of nearly 2 decades that the government has been spending money on refineries. And by the way, who should we be directing these questions to?
I think that from the look of things, based on the list, or at least the precedent that's been created, the president, right from period of President Olusegun Obasanjo, has been retaining the portfolio of Minister of Petroleum. President Obasanjo was the Minister of Petroleum. President Goodluck Jonathan retained that, and also President Muhammad Buhari retained that. We don't know the style of the current president, whether he's going to appoint a substantive petroleum minister. But at least in this past regime, the Minister of State for Petroleum, I'm sorry, I forgot his name now.
Tinubu
Silva gave us an assurance that the Dangote Refinery was going to pump in July. For me, honestly, it's a private organization. I don't see what business government has.
We have 20%.
Yes, that's the point I'm making. I don't see what business government has in investing in a private enterprise. I don't see what the business government has in that. And quite apart from that, we've been told by the labor unions that Dangote Refinery probably will not pump fuel until December, if at all it's going to do that. That's on the one side. The money of the people of Nigeria that has been invested in Port Harcourt, Kaduna, Warri Refinery, there should be an account. There should be a website where you can go to that place and assess how much has been sent, the company that is engaged for the maintenance, the contract that was awarded, because that is transparency indeed. And the president we have now gave us the assurance that he was going to run an open government. So if it was not done by the past regime, by now, once we have a substantive petroleum minister, the first thing he should do is to go to the website and then show us who are the people engaged in the contract, how much was awarded, and then again unbundle NNPC. Because
beyond what it is,
oh
the
yes,
NNPC limited,
you
which
just
is
have
already.
to. If you really want to implement the Petroleum
Industry Act,
PIA, you have to unbundle NNPC.
What does unbundling mean to you? By the way, just on the side, some disagree with you on that definition of industrial action, saying it doesn't mean a strike. You've sent a meaning that it essentially is when workers join together and do something to show that they are unhappy. So to that extent, they believe that a protest is also an industrial action. But back to the major matter, what does unbundling mean to you, really?
Government, you have no control in terms of deciding the template. And then secondly is that you let the affairs be transparent. The managing director of NNPC is still largely a government appointed person. Let the oil companies have a stake. Let the host communities have a stake. Let private sector have a stake, just like you have done to electricity generation, just like you have done to telecoms. Because that is our major source of income. And it seems that everywhere we go, we see that it is the major source of corruption. In terms of knowing the quantum of oil that we are producing daily, in terms of knowing the quantum of oil that we import daily, in terms of knowing the quantum of oil that we consume daily. These things are shrouded in secrecy.
Well, clearly the sector can do with a lot of transparency, and it's not rocket science, really. But we need to go to break. Still a lot of grounds to cover, Mr. Adegboruwa. There's still the ministerial nominees, the screening ongoing, the recent list, which you have, of course, talked about. But we'll take on all of that in just a moment after the break. Please stay with us.